Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I hope I find you safe and well, and looking forward to the long bank holiday weekend. My name's Steve Edmonds. I'm NGA's Director of Advice and Guidance, and it's my pleasure to be delivering this webinar from my kitchen today on the topic of governing boards as employers. And actually, we're going to take a particular look at how the COVID-19 and social distancing issues have impacted on the way that we as governing boards discharge those really important employment responsibilities that we have. So that's the focus of today's webinar, and this is actually the fifth webinar that we've run from NGA in consecutive weeks, and we've been absolutely delighted, thank you, with the response and the feedback that you've given us on the webinars, and to hear from so many of you that you're finding them useful and informative. I think I can speak for the whole NGA team when I say that we're really looking forward to a time when we can be together with you again at our events, making new friends and renewing old acquaintances. But alas, we're not in that period yet. It might be some time before we're able to meet again face to face. But regardless, I think our programme of webinars are here to stay. So please do keep letting us know what you think and what you'd like us to cover in future webinars, because that's really helpful to us and it informs our planning. So in terms of today and what I'd like to cover with you, I'm just going to change slides here. If not, there we go. Thanks for bearing with me. So what I'd like to cover with you today really are three things more than anything else. First of all, how we as governing boards overcome the disruption to the conduct of a wide range of employment processes that involve us as governing boards, but those processes largely operate on the assumption that schools are operating normally and that we're able to access them, which is clearly not the case at the moment. So we'll try and unpick how we deal with those current circumstances. Also how, and this is perhaps the most important aspect of the webinar, how we as governing boards lead the way at this time as exemplary employers in protecting the health and well-being of our school leaders and our staff. But actually it goes wider than that. It's the culture of well-being that we promote throughout our school and to our school community, because we all accept that the impact of COVID will continue to be felt for some time to come, and for some time after there has been some kind of return for most pupils to our schools, and we're envisaging that now, aren't we, as we're expecting an announcement the weekend that will have some bearing on schools. We don't quite know what that is, so we're not going to speculate on that, but that will be felt for some time to come. So it's really important that we think about how best we prepare for that and ensure that our well-being is protected. And that's not to forget the strain and emotional pressure that you're under as well in your own lives as well, and the fact that you'll volunteer your time freely and commit to your schools and your trusts. So it's a whole school approach that we're going to look at, but obviously we'll be doing that through the lens of staff well-being. And then finally, the third aspect of this webinar is to gain a sense of where further guidance might be useful to you from NGA. Now, we've been dealing with a lot, as you can imagine, of queries over the course of the last few weeks, and we've been doing our best to keep you informed and help support you to manage the continuity of business for your governing boards, and do that in a different way, working remotely. And we've been learning all the time ourselves. So these webinars are learning opportunities for us as much as I hope they are for you. So what I'd like you to do is to submit questions. If your devices, and whether you're using a tablet or a mobile or a laptop to view this webinar, your device should have a questions function attached to this webinar, and it would be great if you could submit any questions whilst I'm presenting, that I will pick up later, and indeed any comments. I'll do my best to answer as many questions as I can before we finish at the end of the webinar, but any that I'm unable to answer, what I will do is I will distill them into some form of Q&A document that will accompany our next set of guidance on our role as exemplary employers during this COVID period. And that guidance I'm expecting to be published in the next week or two. So there is an opportunity to pick up and deal with any questions that I'm not able to cover during the webinar. And as I say, these are really are more than anything touch points. I might not be able to get into a particular issue of interest to you or of concern to you in the level of detail that you would hope. And if that's the case, then don't worry, fear not. There is plenty of guidance, help and support out there. And I'm just going to refer to a couple of things in particular. Of course, I'll start with the official advice from the Department for Education, which is available on the gov.uk website. And that advice covers all aspects of school management, leadership and governance during this time. And that includes workforce issues, staffing and deployment, recruitment, pay, and other related areas. So it may well be the case that you have a specific question or inquiry, the answer to which you'll find in that official advice and in the Q&A document for schools on the gov.uk website. So I'll signpost you to that, absolutely. But it also may be the case that you require guidance of a more bespoke nature. You just need to put your query into the context of your particular institution and talk an issue through. Now, what we're trying to do, and what we've been trying to do at NGA, is to learn, what the most common queries and issues are as far as COVID-19 and governance is concerned, and we've been updating our what I call core guidance on business continuity and holding virtual meetings over the course of the last few weeks. In fact, the latest update to our core guidance has been made today and published today, and we'll be signposting that in our newsletter as that is published later today and signposted through our other means of communication as well. So the latest update to our core guidance covers a range of things. For example, the monitoring responsibilities that boards have at this moment in time and are likely to have as we move into a phase where we envisage some kind of return for more pupils to schools. So that's in the current updated guidance on business continuity and holding virtual meetings. And of course, I shouldn't forget to mention our Gold Line Advice Service. Now, this is normally open to governing boards that have gold membership of NGA, but during the period of the COVID-19 crisis and closure of schools, we felt it was appropriate and necessary to open it up to all governing boards so that you had the benefit of that support and that on-the-spot advice. So if you do have any individual queries that relate not only to employer responsibilities, but to the wider functions of governance during this time, then please do contact the NGA Gold Line Advice Service. We have a wonderful team of advisors on hand to talk you through your issues. And in a few moments, I'm going to talk about some of those employer queries that have generated the most advice for the advice team. And what I want to do before I actually talk about those in detail actually is to take the temperature of my audience that I have today and judge, which of those issues concern you most as a governing board at this present time. And the way I'm going to do that is by conducting our first poll of the webinar. And it's a simple question. Which of the following employment, professional, and organisational matters do you think will be of most concern or is indeed of most concern to your governing board, given the disruption that's been caused by the COVID-19 closure of schools? And there are 4 options there and a 5th one if you're not quite sure. Now, I'm taking it as read that the biggest concern that we have at this moment in time is indeed the welfare and well-being of our workforce, and that's why I'm going to move on to that separately and cover that later. So if that's missing from the list, that's the reason why. The options I've got for this poll are recruitment of senior leaders. Has or will this current situation impact on your recruitment of senior leaders? Have you been unable to deliver and see through the consultation requirements and process for a planned restructure and redundancies, or do you see that a problem in the immediate future? Has it created issues for you around meeting the requirements and timescales associated with disciplinary capability or ill health procedures? Or are you more concerned as a governing board about the impact it's had on the performance management cycle for your school leaders that you manage? So those are the 4 options, and what I'm going to do now is open the poll, which I'll do just by wrestling with the technology I have in front of me. I'm going to select that poll and launch it now. Those are the options. We have 4 of those processes, and it may well be the case that you're either well equipped as a governing board, or you're actually not quite sure at this stage which of these processes is going to have the most impact on you. And I can see you're responding to that poll as I speak. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to give you a minute to do that before then I move on and start to unpick some of these issues in a little more detail. Okay, so where are we? So I can see that most of you have voted. We've got about 45 seconds, sorry, on the polling time. So I'm just going to let that run on to about a minute so that you have a good opportunity. And that minute's just about to expire now. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results. And it was not really that conclusive, but very interesting. That it's fairly evenly spread, but the majority of those of you who have identified an issue have identified the issue of performance management and pay, and the impact that the closure of schools and disruption to that process will have on your ability to pick that up at a later stage. And that's perhaps not a great surprise, and that will be something we move on to in a few moments. But as for the other areas, I can see that some of you, it is an issue for you, the recruitment of leaders. It has created an issue for you, and for some indeed restructuring too. So in some way, shape or form, you've all been affected, or your responsibilities have been affected by this very strange situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. So shall we take the opportunity to unpick some of these one by one, in no particular order, just the order that they've appeared in the poll. I'm going to move on and go on to my next slide, which slides aren't moving particularly quickly, so do bear with me. Great, thank you for bearing with me there. I'm sure what, it's always the way, isn't it? Technology slightly plays with your nerves and your anxiety, at least when you don't need it to. So I'm glad that slide moved on, because I'm not sure how much material I had to fill if it didn't do that. So let's start with recruitment, shall we? And school closure and social distancing rules have certainly had an implication. That certainly do have implications for governing bodies seeking to recruit school leaders. There are stages that normally happen in person and face to face that can now only take place by the use of virtual remote platforms. Now that's perhaps less of an issue when it comes to those stages that are more, shall we say, methodical, like the shortlisting process or the ratification meeting, but perhaps more of an issue in terms of the interaction and the dynamics around interview processes and presentations, and how you respond to those and how you manage those from a remote place when you're expecting to do it face to face. Now, this is something for governing boards to weigh up in their own context, and it's perfectly reasonable and fine if you decide to delay the recruitment process for senior leaders if you think that alternative technology that you're needing to use at this time impacts upon you holding a meaningful process, and that the participants engaging in that process won't have the opportunity to do so in a fair and reliable way, because you're not totally assured of the technology, or you just believe it affects the whole dynamic and approach to the process itself. It's perfectly reasonable to delay the process if that's the view of the governing board. The department has been clear about that. But if that's the case, then there will be implications, and I touched on this at my last webinar. If indeed you are choosing to delay, then you'll need to think about the implications in terms of future leadership of your school or your trust, and put in place appropriate contingency support, and that may well involve you contacting your local partners, reaching out to them, whether that's a local authority, neighbouring trusts within your trust, or your local family of schools, to secure the level of interim leadership that you need to tide you over until such time that it's you feel able to carry on with the recruitment process. And there is a risk assessment, of course, associated with making that decision. How long is it reasonable for us to delay the process for? Because we don't quite know at this stage, do we, when things will be back to relative normality, when we will be able to come together in a regular way, and a way that we're used to, as social distancing rules are relaxed. We know that they're not going to sort of immediately disappear. There will be some level of disruption for some time to come. So there is some real strategic thinking that governing boards need to do about recruitment at this time. You shouldn't necessarily make the decision to stop and not proceed, but if you choose to, that's okay, provided that you have the appropriate contingencies in place. And if you do proceed and you're using those virtual platforms to carry out the process, then of course that requires a level of thought and strategic planning about how you adjust that process to fit the way that you're now managing it. And for me, in that position, if I was in that position, I would certainly seek the advice of a HR professional, and indeed a school improvement professional as well, about the way to use a technology to its best approach. So that's recruitment. Shall we move on then to our next area, which is restructuring and/or redundancy, which is something that some of you, in fact 11% of you according to the poll, have an issue with at this moment in time. Now, the whole logistics of fulfilling consultations around restructuring or redundancy are very challenging when schools aren't open. I think that's a pretty obvious statement. And in those circumstances, in all probability, it's not going to be possible to fulfill those requirements at this time, either because you have other priorities, which clearly schools do, or the capacity to carry those consultation arrangements out and have those strategic conversations has been curtailed because of the social distancing and the inability to work out of school, if you like. So that therefore has the potential to have wider impact on the school and the pupils, because the restructuring is probably business critical. It's integral to achieving your strategic objectives as a board for the way you want to move your school and trust forward and deliver its outcomes, but also in terms of its sustainability, its ongoing sustainability as well, financial sustainability. So there are implications, and Therefore, the conversation that you have as a governing board about it being prudent to pause also needs to take into consideration how long you think you can reasonably sustain that position before you have to look at pressing forward and working around the issues and the logistics presented by social distancing restrictions at this moment in time. Now, if your decision to delay has those wider financial implications, it may actually make your deficit budget situation worse or create a deficit budget situation. Well, in those situations, part of your contingency planning, of course, should involve who you reach out to and an approach to mitigate as far as possible for that issue. For example, seeking short-term financial support from the ESFA. So no easy way around restructuring or redundancy, but my assessment is that in most cases you'll probably have no alternative but to put them on hold and consider when you can do them and you have logistical ability to. So moving on, that brings us on to procedures, disciplinary capability, ill health, that kind of thing. And a smaller proportion of you engaging in this webinar envisaged issues with those employment procedures. And of course, it's all about the social distancing rules. These processes usually take place face to face, and the department's advice is that the social distancing rules don't necessarily mean they have to grind to a halt. They should take place within the normal timescales using those alternative platforms like video conferencing. That's the official advice from the department, but they readily accept that it's the governing boards to decide whether it's necessary to delay them, essentially for the same reasons that I've just referred to in the context of recruitment and restructuring, because the parties involved in that process engaging in it through an online platform do not have the sufficient confidence, opportunity to engage appropriately or reliably in the process, and therefore it brings it in some way into disrepute. If that's a considered judgment of the governing board, then it's perfectly reasonable to delay that hearing and to work outside of the timescales. And it may well be that you do reach that decision because you just look at the complexity of the case, the witnesses involved, and the amount of evidence that you have to consider, and think, actually, we just can't do this remotely. We need to be together. There's all sorts of scenarios that you can envisage, like, for example, a professional association rep wanting to have a quiet word with their with the person they're representing, and that thing happens all the time, doesn't it, in hearings? And we don't think too much of it when we're all in the same room, but it presents a slightly different challenge if we're if we're elsewhere engaging from our homes. So it may well be that you think, actually, it's just not appropriate, it's not in anyone's interest to proceed. But again, those decisions should be revisited because they do have well-being considerations both ways. The well-being impact of proceeding on the participants if it's not a fair and reliable process, but also the well-being considerations of not proceeding or putting it on hold for an indefinite period in terms of the anxiety and the issues that creates. So again, in your own context as a governing board, you'll need to weigh up those factors and then reach a decision about how long you can reasonably delay these proceedings for before you think, actually, we're going to have to try and work around this using remote technology. So those are some of that's disciplinary and ill health and processes and procedures. But the majority of you referred to appraisal and the appraisal process as being something that you were most concerned about, given the fact that schools are closed and not, for most pupils, are not operating as normal at this moment in time. And it's understandable that you're concerned, because as we know, those of us who've been involved in these processes, they're based on an annual cycle. Objectives are set and they're reviewed throughout the year, and they're based on the school or the organisation operating as usual throughout the year. Well, that's clearly not the case at this moment in time. The vast majority of objectives, I would say, for all of us, whatever line of work we're in, will have been affected in an adverse way by the fact that we've had to adjust our priorities to deal with this crisis. So for governing boards, it's really important that at the earliest available opportunity, we sit down with our school leaders, take stock, reset, and adjust those objectives and those priorities to reflect and acknowledge what we've been through and what we're going to be going through in the weeks and months ahead. There's no more than good common sense ethical leadership, and it follows, doesn't it, that as those objectives are likely to have pay considerations or pay progression attached to them, then it would not be wise to do anything other than consider those pay progression matters favourably and ensure that no one is suffering to their detriment rather, as a consequence of having to manage the COVID-19 situation to the extent where they just haven't been able to achieve those objectives that were set at a time when we either didn't know or never heard of COVID-19, or we just could not have imagined the impact that it was going to have. Again, it may feel like I'm teaching people to suck eggs here, but sometimes we just need the permission, don't we, to sit back and sit outside of these processes that we're part of as a governance community and reflect on what is the right and best thing to do. And clearly, it is the right and best thing to do, to take stock and to reset and adjust to reflect to the circumstances. So that's in broad terms how some of those processes that are of concern to you and are exercising you at this time should be treated. And as I move on to my next slide, I really want to get to what I think is the heart of our webinar today, and that's the well-being considerations of COVID-19 and how it causes us now, or gives us an opportunity to really reflect on the culture of well-being that runs through our school and trust. It's absolutely vital, as you know, and I'm grateful to those of you who've participated so far. NGA is currently running its annual governance survey, and it's a really important point in the governance calendar where we get the opportunity to take stock and understand and take the temperature of the sector. And so if you've not participated yet in our survey, please do. There are some questions about COVID-19 and how that's affected your governing practice and how it will influence it going forward. So well worth participating in that survey. It just helps us provide that sector leadership on your behalf. But well-being, I can tell you, and you won't be surprised, is coming head and shoulders above everything else when it comes to the concerns that have been expressed through our survey. This awful disease has brought grief to some and enormous changes to all our daily lives. And you'll have seen with your schools the enormous pressure that our leaders and staff have been under to maintain a level of provision for those who need it, at the same time as maintaining continuity of education for those pupils who are at home. And schools won't be bouncing back into normal service anytime soon, even if some kind of return for most pupils or more pupils, not most, more pupils is on the cards. Schools just aren't going to bounce back from this. No walk of life or society is. So this is now the time when we really should bring into sharp focus our duty of care that we have, particularly towards our school leaders and their staff teams, but also how we look after each other, as a school community, those of us who govern, our wider stakeholders, our parents and our pupils, that cultural wellbeing that runs throughout the school. And on a, one of the key messages I think from a staffing and a HR employer perspective is that in no way is wellbeing an acceptable price to pay for achieving outcomes, whether those outcomes are pressing the reset button and bringing the normal resumption of school life to a reality, whether that's the outcome or whether we see making up for lost time in some way with all good motives as being the outcome. There's in no way should the well-being of our staff and the people who work at our school and indeed our pupils be the price that we pay to achieve that. So I think that's a really important key message. And in the spirit of reflection, I'd like to launch my next poll, because this next poll is about how we currently view well-being and approach well-being as a strategic issue, as a cultural thing within our governing sphere of responsibility. So the question I'm going to ask, and I'm just going to bring the poll up now, and I'm just wrestling with the technology here for the poll. I'm just not quite sure what to do at this stage. Let me just try that again. Do apologise for. There we go. Great. Thank you for bearing with me there. As you can see, my slickness and professional webinar management skills probably need a little enhancing, but hey, it's all learning, isn't it? And the question I want to ask about wellbeing is, I'm going to assume that for all of us, because it is, wellbeing is a priority, but now is a time for us as governing boards to reflect on how much of a priority it is for our governing board and how we approach this issue generally. So is your governing board one that actually takes an active role in the strategic planning, the modelling and monitoring of staff wellbeing as a really important cultural aspect of school life? Or is your governing board more one that recognises the importance of wellbeing in the life of the school, but kind of leaves the planning, the modelling and the leadership of it to your executive leaders, and you actually raise it occasionally and underpin that with nice gestures like cakes for the staff room? Or is your approach as a governing board, generally speaking, more a reactive one? Do you wait to be informed of wellbeing issues by your executive leader and then you work through them and troubleshoot those problems? Now, those are three quite binary choices, and you might say, well, actually, we fall somewhere between those three statements, or I don't know, or I'm not sure. It'd be really good just to get a sense from our audience. I can see you're voting already while I've been rattling on, which is great, to get a sense of exactly how you approach wellbeing at this moment in time. There we go. So I can see actually that most of you have voted already. So I'm going to close that poll and share it with you. And you can see that the majority, I'm really pleased to see that, do take an active strategic role, but not all of you. Not all of you, in fact. There's a significant proportion that are perhaps a little more reactive when it comes to wellbeing rather than strategic. You all recognise the issue, but you're more likely to pick up issues or wait for them to be reported than actually drive the strategic leadership of wellbeing. Well, now more than at any time, this is probably an opportunity to reflect and think, well, do we need as a governing board to change that emphasis? Do we need to have a different priority of a way we approach wellbeing, because there are an absolute welter of issues that the school sector are facing now and will be facing in the coming weeks and months. And here's just a few on that slide there: how we respond to the volume of guidance and legislation. Not all of it very clear. Schools will be wrestling with that. They'll also be wrestling with that weight and responsibility around reopening, the safeguarding and wellbeing implications, how that plays out in terms of social distancing and equipment that's needed to keep everyone in school safe, how we adjust back from remote working or continue remote working, and the wellbeing impact those things have, the different operational requirements, all those things at the same time as managing the issues and the impact of life in general, and the sad consequences of COVID-19, such as bereavement, which is something we covered recently in one of our own NGA briefings. So there's a whole raft of wellbeing issues and a huge burden, particularly on our school leaders, that we as governing boards will want to share and support each other to deal with. And now, in terms of strategic response, every institution is different. You all have your own unique character. You all have your own approach, and that's absolutely right, because it should be context driven. You're all special places. You all have your own unique character. But when it comes to an effective wellbeing strategy, a meaningful wellbeing strategy and culture, I think there are a few characteristics that you should be able to recognise in all approaches to wellbeing, whatever form they take. And I've distilled them on this next slide, which I'm about to share, as the key elements of a wellbeing strategy. The first element now I think is absolutely crucial, is looking after your senior leaders, because they will bear the most burden at this time. They will be supporting others. It's a lonely old place being a leader, and they almost, many of the leaders I've met, and I think you'll agree with this, almost need the permission sometimes to look after themselves. So you as governing boards should be really modelling that approach to self-care that you want to see throughout the school, that exemplifies the rest of the staff and the pupils and the wider community. So if your leaders aren't looking after themselves, it's very difficult for them to look after others and implement your strategy throughout the school. Assessing risk is really important, and risk assessment should be embedded within governing practice anyway. But in this particular context, it's understanding where those pressure points are. And for example, you may have younger members of staff or a younger staff cohort who are experiencing a crisis for the first time in their career of great magnitude and of real change for the first time, and that may be where the particular pressures are in your school or trust. Well, what are the mitigating factors? How are you going to mitigate for those? How are you going to deal with those? What's the support that you can put in place? Communicating and demonstrating commitment, really important. We've been absolutely humbled by what we've heard from school leaders about the supportive messages they've received from those governing during this period. It means an awful lot, and it will continue to mean a lot in the coming weeks and months ahead. And also the commitment that you've demonstrated as governors and trustees to ensuring that the burden on the shoulders of our school leaders and staff is managed and manageable. So you're thinking about their own working practices and the role that you play in terms of your interaction with them at this time. And that's actually demonstrating that commitment, which is great to see. I think every effective wellbeing strategy that I've encountered has included some level of resource afforded to confidential external support that staff can reach out to and access in times of need. And what underpins that strategy from a governing perspective is an approach that's more about checking in more than checking up. And what I mean by that is that as relative normality resumes, those normal checks and balances of governance need to resume as well. No one's saying they don't, but we need to think about the way that we are demonstrating or rendering account and holding our school leaders and their staff to account, because we need to take into account the disruption and the high levels of anxiety and concern that will continue for some time to come. So, you know, think about the way we approach accountability at this time. I think is very important, and monitoring at regular intervals just how well things are going and how people are doing and how effective our overarching strategy is. Those things are really important, and I would say they characterise all types of wellbeing strategy, whatever, you know, particular words or level of presentation is. And I'd also say, I want to say this really before we come to the end of this sort of wellbeing aspect of the webinar, is that it's much more organic, isn't it, than a process or a procedure or a document. Those aren't the things that achieve a culture of wellbeing. They help keep us on track, and they give us a point of reference and something to talk about and something to measure. But it's more the culture and the philosophy of wellbeing that really makes a difference. And for me, as a chair of a governing board, it's important at my school, as any wellbeing process or document or strategy, is knowing that the staff at my school, if they're down, someone will notice. If they need help, someone will notice. And when they're struggling, someone will step in and offer to support them, both in that moment and for as long as it takes. And for me, as chair of a governing board, it's one question, you know, I can ask my head teacher or school leader or any school leader I'm privileged enough to work with about wellbeing. It will be something around that, you know, would you notice if someone was down, needed help or struggling, and what would you do in that moment? And if you can answer that question and answer it well and with confidence, then you're on the right lines, in my humble opinion. So I hope that's been a useful sort of overview, really, of what I think the wellbeing issues are in particular at this time. And I'm acutely aware that we are short of time now, and time is always our enemy when we do these things. So I did promise I'd get on to one or two questions, and I'm going to be very brief now, because we haven't got a great deal of time, and I'm just looking at some of these questions, and actually they're quite operational. So I'm just going to restrict myself to one, I think, and then I'll take my time to unpick the others. And the one that's actually follows on nicely from the wellbeing conversation is what happens and how do we respond if staff refuse to attend school because they believe it's too dangerous. Now, this is a challenging issue that's actually being raised with our advice service, and it's a challenging issue for schools both at this moment in time and after the expected announcement that we'll see some kind of return for more pupils. And the first thing I would say actually is that it's our duty of care to employees is clearly paramount. And so that when we are assessing the risk and putting the measures in place to mitigate for those risks, it should be done so on the assumption that school will not be open unless it's safe to do so. So whether that is putting things in place like rotors, protective equipment, ratios, cleaning routines, those kind of things, they're all there with the overarching objective to ensure that anyone who is in school is actually safe, otherwise school would not be open. So in that context, the hard-nosed response to the question would be to assume that those things are in place. The staff have a contractual obligation to be there, therefore saying it's too dangerous is not really an acceptable reason to be absent. Now, as we move forward in the next few weeks, these things will be considered, I'm sure, on a case-by-case basis, and common sense and ethics dictate that the manager and the employee will should first, try and work through these concerns before we get wrapped up into a process. But I do understand what's behind that question and the anxiety too. I've had other questions on furloughing, and what else have we got? What is our role in assessing risk? That's a really good question. Risk management is fundamental now and at all times for governing boards, and we've actually produced some new guidance on risk that we're about to launch out in the next week or two, which we think will be a useful contribution to that conversation. So that's something I'll include in the Q&A document that we publish in the next week or two as well, reference to that. But I'm just going to whiz towards the end of this webinar now, because I've taken enough of your time, by reminding you that throughout this period, even though our offices are closed, we're available and continuing to support you with our updated guidance, with our advice service, with these webinars, and indeed with our blogs and newsletters, where we're learning a lot from your experience as well. So do keep letting us know what you think and how we can help you. And always important to mention that the learning continues, even if we can't be together. So do consider our Learning Link platform, which we're very proud of, our e-learning platform, which is not only affordable, it's flexible and gives you the knowledge to act at this time as well. If you need to find out a little bit more about Learning Link, there's plenty of information on our website about that as well. So I think that's brought me to the end of the time I have with you, probably a little longer than you anticipated spending with me. I hope it's not been too challenging spending the extra time. I've enjoyed delivering this webinar, and I very much look forward to delivering on a future topic. But in the meantime, what I'd like to say to you is thank you for all that you're doing at this time. It really is a privilege to support you because you do so much on behalf of others. Do stay healthy, do look after those that are closest to you. Have a wonderful long weekend, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future. Take care. Bye-bye.